that's typically how most larger enterprises have planned, that I've talked to anyways. That's, or an additional one for your high availability if you don't use it for a backup type solution. And more and faster disks for a production environment to improve performance. We talked a little bit about that already, dividing it up into the multiple disks. And one thing that I don't read a lot about is using slower disks or different types of disk options for dev, QA, and staging. So typically, what we've seen in a couple larger environments where we've talked to Microsoft about is in our dev environment, our QA staging have kind of like a tier 2 level type of storage. In other words, it's not quite as fast, not as responsive, not quite as large usually. Okay, and that's going to save you money in the end. Okay, that's kind of what I talked about there. When you're running in a large-scale enterprise, and you have a sandbox environment, you have a dev environment, you have a QA environment. Some places have a staging environment and a QA environment. You can't be using the top-of-the-line storage for everything. Money goes out the window very fast. As you guys probably all know, with SharePoint adding additional servers and storage space, it really sucks up the money pretty fast. That's for sure. I scoped out an additional storage project. It's going to cost about $350,000 just for the storage, additional storage in our environment. So the more you can save the money here, you can put it back in the coffers for your actual production environment.
What did that 350 buy you?
Bought a lot of stand storage, bought some connections, bought some more fiber cabling. Everything we use is fiber. Redundancy, allows us some redundancy for that. The disks, Microsoft recommends that you use at least 4 physical disks and use separate disks to keep the log files and swap drives and the program files. It's a very good idea to maximum speed. They recommend that you allocate at least 200 gigs of disk space for the operating system and temporary files, and 150 of disk space for logs. What I noted, and I've been finding this out, especially when you're starting out, and if you do have, let's say, a little on the larger side environment, when you're starting out, you're still going to have quite a bit of content, and if you start moving things around a lot, you need to have temporary storage to handle those exports, imports, backups for the temporary storage. So I put there, when you plan to export or backup a large set, there needs to be enough temporary storage to handle the files. For example, a 50 gig site collection is approximately 60 gigs of free drive space. If you only have scoped out 150 gig section and divided by 3 partitions on your web front ends, when you're taking out 60 gigs, there's not always going to be 60 gigs. So that's why I've always said the bigger you go on the front ends, the 250, 350 gigs on the front ends, the better you're off. The better you are off in the future for doing things, moving these large site collections and so forth when you're in these large-scale environments. Also, I meant for high availability, make sure that you allocate an additional server, that you can pull one server out of the network load balancing and recycle without affecting service availability. We had this before. We actually had a crash with one of our servers. We had to run actually with 2 front ends for a while until we got a server rebuilt. So we were lucky we had the 3. If you do have 4 or 5 front ends in a large environment, very handy if something actually does totally go kablooey, your OS wipes out, something corrupt, your physical disk. We had a physical disk have some problems this week. The more you have an extra server with extra storage on hand, the better. Okay, especially for your high availability. Again, those are your large environments. You're going to have that high availability typically. And I just mentioned there, in typically a large map, you're going to have at least 3 web front ends. And having that extra is very handy. It was nice for us going down to the 2 at the time. I think we only had about 20,000 users in the environment at that time. And so pulling one out, running on 2 for about a week or so, maybe it's 2 weeks, we got by. Barely, but we got by. I'm not going to talk too much on this one. Some type of monitoring solution for drive space issues. We have this tool called Servers Alive. It can also monitor size, so very handy that something happens, we get down. It can monitor size in any type of drive too. It can monitor your front ends, you can monitor your application servers, and your database drives, any of them. So we actually watch that very carefully. We have, you can put a sizing on the drives. You're always sent an alert. BMC does this also for it has agents on the SQL servers or your application or your front ends, and it'll send out alerts to the various people. You have to have that nowadays. I carry a pager. I think everybody within our large-scale team has a pager. These SMS messages get sent out automatically to notify you of low drive space, so that you can, if you plan for it, you can add those drives in. Add the 500 gigabyte drive, have no problems after that. And that also allows you to move content databases around also. So that's something you're planning for these front ends, putting that monitoring solution in place. I just gave an example there of, you must have 15 gigs free or send something off. You can put that 20, 25. I know our BMC tool for our databases, at 25%, it will send out an initial alert to actually say, hey, you've only got 25% left in your environment. And then it'll send a different type of a monitoring message at 20% and then one at 10% if you don't take care of it. Very handy to keep up track of how much storage space you actually have. Talked a little bit about that, removing the event log viewers with automated PowerShell, zipping them up in log files, zip log files on a regular basis to save space. So we've talked mostly, so far we've talked mostly about the front ends. That's a big chunk of the debugging, the monitoring, and so forth. Talk a little bit about the indexing. As you saw with the scoped one from the HP sizing tool, it's saying use your index server as a separate physical server. It's most often the memory intensive role. It makes it a less ideal candidate for virtualization. Virtualized index server role might be appropriate for development environment, small farm, or farm with small content usage. Again, we're talking large, so we typically don't do that in our environment. We have a dedicated server. It's a dedicated physical box for our index server. We look at, take that into account that the index can vary from 10% to 30% of the total size of the documents being indexed. Large indexes above 200 gigs consider using physical disk volume that is dedicated to the individual query server rather than virtual disk. That's where we're headed right now. We're headed in that direction. For large farms with big amount of crawled data, use physical index server role due to the large amount of memory requirements. Something you also have to think about, how the memory is handled, and the high disk I/O activity. The SQL databases. I don't want to go into this too much. This really is its own separate topic. We could have a whole night on this. Just talking about storage and SQL databases. Use of stand storage, obviously. Any type of clustered solution with the SQL database is going to use multiple servers with SAN storage. Okay, there's no limitations on the number of disks that can be accessible. I think in our SQL server right now, I don't know, I think we have maybe 8 drives, anywhere between 300 and 500 gigs, I think, per drive. They're easier to install additional servers with the same storage, obviously. Easier to manage many servers. It's easier to reallocate this storage between servers. Separate database data and transaction log files across different disks. We do that. Transaction log files for a large environment, when you start talking 20,000, 40,000 users, they tend to get huge. You got to look at truncation of these logs if you can. Again, in a mirrored and clustered environment, there's a little bit more tricks to that. But these things could be, 50 gigs, 80 gigs, 100 gigs plus the transaction logs. So you really got to keep your eye on those for these heavily used sites in a large environment. For your best performance, place the temp DB on array 10 array. Again, that's for integrity. And I think for us anyways, the database data and transaction log files, you're going to have your database data across multiple drives and your transaction logs across multiple drives, just because they get so huge.
Yeah, I wonder if the SQL database is a centralized database or across different locations?
For us, we use centralized, we use clustered and mirroring solution.
Okay.
So
Is it
the
good?
mirror is not on site. So you have your mirror off-site, but
Yeah.
close by.
Yeah, but it's centralized. Is it split up to split for different locations, like one?
Yeah, we don't use that. Good idea for a huge environment. Like, I guess I'm trying to think, the insurance place I used to work with, they would use something like that, because they're different time zones, different parts of the world. And the only thing I guess about that would be, I mean, if you're going to have identical information on those across the world, you're going to have some very large individual or clusters of databases. The only environment that I've seen like that is AIG, where AIG is a worldwide company, 130 countries, and you will have a type of clustered environment in Japan, there's a clustered environment in the States, and there's a clustered environment over in London. That's how they have that set up. For us, we're typically Canadian based. We use that mirrored solution for our DR solution. In other words, it's replicating the information on a continual basis. And if we, well, I think it was about 2 years ago, we had a lightning strike actually at our data center. Actually had a lightning strike, and it blew out the power generator. And this is at a time where we didn't have our DR solution in place, and SharePoint was down until they got that generator going. I think it was about 3 days later. They got everything fully running again, and if we had had this type of solution, this mirrored solution, at an offsite storage, we could have been there. We've actually done a DR failover test. We do it in about 2.5 hours. We could have been up and running with that mirrored type of solution for SharePoint. So as SharePoint really ramps up and you get tens of thousands of users using it, it becomes more important to the business, obviously. You'll want to look at something like a mirrored solution for your SQL servers. Typically, you're always going to have a clustered solution.
What are you mirroring? Content databases? And
Yeah.
then you have to manually hook it up to the DR file?
No, you don't have to manually. It automatically replicates everything about every 10 minutes.
So you have... Okay.
It's hot. Yeah, it's
Okay.
hot. You just swap it out and just kind of flip your DNS, flip your load balancing onto the other load balancer at the DR farm, DR setup, and go from there. So it would be
So on
hot,
the farm, you have your own separate volumes for config and
Yeah.
search and all that.
everything.
But that's not being replicated. You're only mirroring the content databases?
Yeah.
Well, some
Cross.
people don't really support full-featured search in their DR, right? Like, you don't
Yeah.
have to have everything as good as your real production. But
True.
it's a good thing to have, but you don't have to.
But it is
At
hot
the-
swappable how we've got it set up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's very
there was a
quick.
very cool demo at the SharePoint conference in the keynote where they had these 2 racks of gear. It was more of a SQL demo than a SharePoint demo. Basically, they had this, was it 15 terabyte content database?
No, 140 something terabytes.
It was this massive content database live running there with a mirrored environment behind it. You
7,500
could,
users.
so they were hammering it with 7,500 concurrent users. They were showing the metrics of the response time against and everything else. And you could see the beads of the sweat on the guy that had to walk up to the rack and grab that LAN cord and yank it out and say, okay, the servers just went offline. That whole farm just disappeared. And you can see all the monitors drop to 0, nobody's getting through, pages aren't coming back, and the keynotes are still talking, and about 20-25 seconds later it starts to come back to life. The usage ramps back up, 10,000 users are hitting that farm again, and it just was blitzed and back on again.
I wish we could do it that fast.
It was pretty impressive. I mean, they had a lot of dollars worth of gear up
We've
on that
actually,
stage.
we've actually went
Very
through it, I
expensive
think,
demo.
3
Yes.
times. 3 times we've done it actually so far. Flipped over the DR and ran it for a few weeks. And we had very few problems. We were surprised. I think, if I remember this, I think it was the custom web apps for some reason had a few problems. I don't know why that was. But again, those were fixed after a couple additional hours. But everything literally was flipped from one environment to the other in about 2.5 hours. And we do have a full, we have 5 plus 2, 7 servers in our production. We have 7 servers in our demo.
So how do you handle that from an operational perspective? Because we have like hundreds of content databases, right? So we're splitting them up every single day. So then each mirror set has to be set up individually, like on a database
Yeah.
level. And how does your DR farm know that you just created a new content database in Pride? I mean, right? Because you have to attach that to your web app.
We have our change management. Every time you do our change management is very rigorous. You have to have that in your plan, your change management plan, so that when a content database is created, that the database team, typically offshore, is going to mirror that the night after that night, the night of, after that change has gone through. So the database team, the offshore, is typically always going to handle that type of thing. So you're doing a lot of content databases. We don't do that many. But could they handle that many? Yeah, they could actually. They could handle, mirroring doesn't take all that long. It's to do that many for our offshore team with the change management practices in place. I don't think it would be that big of an issue. It's more the issue that stuff going back and forth.
Just a quick clarification, you're doing async mirroring, log shipping.
Yeah.
Or you're doing log shipping.
No, it's not. It's doing.
So then they're not read-only targets. If I log ship, I can only log ship a read-only target. If I async mirror,
I'm
then
just trying to think. I'm trying to think the DR environment. I don't go all.
you
into
couldn't be
that.
synchronous because you won't be able to hit the performance numbers required by SharePoint. So the only thing you can think of is your asynchronous mirror.
I'd have to check.
But some people pull back and actually use log shipping, which is the easiest one,
Yeah,
which means all your targets have to be read-only.
yeah, I'd have to check on that. Yeah, I don't think the
So
DR.
we actually
It's fine
ran,
because they're passive.
we actually
Yeah.
ran into that, and so we got away from the whole mirroring. We're using SAN level true copy from the data center and data center, but then we have to use PowerShell. So if we have a DR event,
Yeah.
we have scripts to attach all those content databases, fill over
Automatically.
the reminds from, right? And
No, we
that's
do
why it's
too.
nice.
We do have the scripts, but typically right now, yeah, it doesn't take much to add content databases over, but everything. It must be a read-only. I'm just trying to think about how they're all set up. I think it is a read-only.
Okay, so you're just basic log shipping.
I think that's what it is.
It's the easiest one to do.
I'd have to check again. We try to do our DR failover once a year, just just to make sure everything's good, which is a good practice, obviously. But I
So
don't-
what's your SLA service when you fail over? You're not giving them update capabilities?
Well, we failed over, like I said, for that 2 weeks, yeah, they can do anything. Once we fail over, anything goes.
So the failback is a fairly significant process for it.
Again, well, I mean, it's not,
Once you start
it's
updating,
not
how do you get it
5
back?
minutes.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest problems
Yeah.
most people are afraid
It's
of.
2.5 each way. No, because
So you start mirroring the other direction.
yeah, exactly. It goes back.
Well, you have to